Okay, I think we should get going. This is a session organized by Mark Kane, Solomon Chung, and myself. I'm David Lobel. We actually are starting off with a withdrawn paper, which means we have a couple options. I said I was going to just tell jokes for 10 minutes, but Saul didn't like my jokes, so we're going to do another strategy, which is to have the poster presenters come up and give a sort of a 2-minute advertisement for their poster, a little quick summary of what they looked at and what they found. And the nice thing here is, unlike most sessions, we're actually simultaneous with the poster session, and it's right next door, so you can hopefully contain yourself till the end of the talks, and then you can walk over to the poster sessions. And so I think the order was predetermined, so maybe you guys can just follow order and come on up. Kyle is first. Please state your name and institution too. Thanks.
My name is Kyle Meng. I'm from Columbia University, and our poster, which is joint with Solomon Xiang, who's at Princeton, and Mark Kane at Columbia University, explores what we think is the central distinction between the social impacts of climate variation with the social impacts of weather variation, and namely that climatic variation, in our case, ENSO, has a large spatial footprint, and so these, in theory, can generate a lot of spillover effects that might not occur with idiosyncratic local weather shocks. So we look at several lines of evidence. The first is some prima facie evidence looking at what happens to agricultural country level, agricultural output, and revenue under climatic events, ENSO events, versus weather events, and we find very strong effects, much stronger effects with ENSO. We then look at food prices and find that food prices respond, local food prices respond to ENSO variation and not really to local weather variation. And then we also find that the spatial the spatial correlation of ENSO-driven food prices has much larger extent on a continental scale than local weather variation or food prices driven by local variation. And then furthermore, ENSO-driven food prices tend to be, there's something to be market effects anticipating strong ENSO events. So we think for these various different reasons, when we think about impacts of climate change, really we should be looking at these large spatially coherent events and less so these local idiosyncratic events. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Michael Glauder. I'm coming from the University of Chicago. So one of the main ways that climate impacts are currently addressed in U.S. regulatory law is through the government-mandated evaluation of the social cost of carbon. One of the models that we use to evaluate the social cost of carbon has an unphysical carbon cycle model that does not allow for the long-term warming that we expect from this long tail of CO2. So what we do is we swap in a more physical carbon cycle model that's able to capture the warming that we expect to see from this long tail of CO2. And what we find is that the social cost of carbon doesn't really change. And this leads us to conclude that the social cost of carbon is largely insensitive to changes in climate damages. So then, upon further analysis, we find that although most of this field is currently working on evaluating the magnitude of the climate damages, we think that it is just as important, if not more important, to evaluate the actual application of these damages on economic growth. So if you want to come learn about how damages are applied to social cost of carbon, come to my poster. Thanks.
I'm Daiju Narita from Kiel Institute for the World Economy, Germany, and our poster is titled Global Losses and Declining Vulnerability to Tropical Cyclone, and joint work with Solomon. Tropical cyclones cause a significant economic impact, and under climate change, tropical cyclones are expected to intensify, and they could be a major component of climate change damage. And past several decades, there's an observed increasing trend of damage of tropical cyclones. And broadly speaking, there are three hypotheses for explaining that. The first one is that's because of climate change and the intensifying storms. And the second hypothesis is this is purely explained by behavioral change. For example, more people move to the coastal areas, which are more likely to be affected by storms. And the third hypothesis would be this is purely could be explained by reporting bias. So improving reporting over years. But the previous studies didn't give a clear answer to that question because the trend was not compared with physical data of storm exposure. And that's what we did in this analysis. We reconstructed storm track data between 1950 and 2008 and created physical exposure data. And we analyzed the damage data with exposure data. And our results show there's a controlling for the storm exposure. There's actually decreasing trend of damage, and which suggests the third hypothesis, which is reporting bias or improving reporting, could explain observed increasing trend of global damage of storms. But that pattern doesn't show up for strongest storms and agricultural damage. So storms, tropical cyclones, will still likely to be major important factor for future climate change damage. Thank you.
Christina here.
Hi, I'm Larry Paxton from the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory. We've got a poster, number 64, on Gaia. It's our project of global assimilation of information for action. It's a decision-based system, and we're looking at the integrated application of techniques that have been built up over 60 years of operations research at the Applied Physics Laboratory and applying those to climate change and weather issues. If you're interested in looking at some of the details of some of the work we've done, you can look at our website, gaia.jhuapl.edu. It's poster number 64. And what our the essential thesis of our work is that in order to apply an integrated solution to these problems, we take a system engineering approach, which is what we're known for at the Applied Physics Lab, and look at this system of systems by breaking down into a set of requirements. There are three pillars to our approach: data access and visualization. The second approach is the integrated cyber workshops that enable you to develop a community of practice. And the third is what we call serious games, where we've repurposed technologies used for lack of a better word, for wargaming, to apply to the solution of these kind of problems, to develop approaches that decision makers can understand and incorporate a risk-based analysis in their planning. And so the scientific community provides the underpinnings for these models and the approaches, and these are translated into actionable information that people are able to explore. Because one of the challenges is that models, of course, have inherent uncertainties in them. And so how does the decision maker deal with the uncertainties or the variation in predictions and still actually enable them to take action, to move forward, make decisions and infrastructure investments? Thanks.
Hi, my name is Jesse Antilla Hughes. I'm at Columbia University. And my poster is titled Disaster, Destruction, and Death, it's work joint with Solomon Xiang. And basically the setup is we've grown really well informed recently about the sort of macro level damages caused by environmental disaster. But there's still a lot that we don't know about what actually happens to individual households and people, especially after a disaster has occurred. So what we do is we go in and we take a measure of exposure to typhoons or Western Pacific tropical cyclones for the Philippines, which is one of the nations in the world that gets hit the most. And what we're able to do is we're then able to sort of unpack exactly what goes on with economic and health data after the storm is impacted. And what we find is that there's a large reduction in household incomes the year after a storm has hit that appears to be due to a sort of loss of productivity of capital and damage to capital. That is, we find it across income subgroups, and we see that it's matched almost entirely by a dip in household expenditures. So we see that people are spending less on a variety of things, but especially some of the more sort of longer horizon investment goods, such as education and medicine, and especially sort of high nutrient foods. So then what we do is we go in and we take a look at the health data for households in the same areas, and we find that there's actually a large increase in the infant death rate in Filipino households the year following storms that decreases over the 2 to 3 years afterwards, that is found almost entirely amongst female infants. And a variety of things that we find, both structural similarities in both the economic and health losses, as well as a variety of sort of economic arguments such as indications that female infants are more likely to die if they have older siblings, especially older brothers. Basically comes together to imply that what's going on is you have these households, they're made poorer, and as a result, there's a sort of sparsity in intra-household allocation that results, and you end up with the poorest person in the household and sort of the most vulnerable person in the household being hurt the most. Of particular note is that we find that the total impact of this is actually significantly larger than the blunt trauma impact. So we see that in general, on an average year in the Philippines, about 700 people lose their lives, according to official government reporting. But we estimate that on the order of 10,000 baby girls die every year following storms due to the economic damages from those storms. It's just much more dispersed and demographic, and that's why no one's noticed it thus far.
Great. Thank you to all the poster presenters. They sound very interesting. AGU is known for keeping the most interesting stuff for Friday afternoon to keep the crowds down. So we're going to move on now to the main talks. Excuse me. Just a note to the speakers, when you see the orange light start flashing or showing up, that means to start either speaking faster or skipping slides. And then when you get a question, this is a little bit different than most sessions in that it's being videotaped. So you want to try as hard as you can to repeat the question, or else I'll probably nudge you to repeat the question. So our first speaker is Max Alfarmer from UC Berkeley, I think it's pronounced. And he's going to be talking about climate change and electricity consumption.
All right. Thank you for inviting me to give a talk here. It's really nice to follow this paper by Saul and Jesse. It's one of my favorite working papers currently out there, so you should definitely read it, maybe more so than my own paper. What I'm going to talk about today is work I've become interested in about 2 years ago, which looks at basically trying to figure out from observed data how electricity consumption responds to weather, and then link that through the use of climate models to think about bounding the effect of climate change on electricity consumption in the state of California. So there's a number of papers which I'm trying to merge into one 15-minute talk here, using both aggregate data at the grid level and using a very nice, neat, new household level data set that has almost 1 billion electricity bills in it. So I click forward by hitting the space key? Sure. Okay. So what the grid level work essentially does here is I observe hourly load on the grid, and I'm an economist. I apologize if I get some of the physical science expressions not exactly right. But the way I envision this is number of electrons pulsating through the grid at any point in time. I have hourly weather data, and I use statistical methods to figure out how grid load responds to hourly temperature. So what you see here on the screen is for a couple of the grids in California, most importantly one at the bottom left is how the California Independent System Operator load responds to hours in temperature bins. So there's a clear nonlinear response here where at low temperatures, if it gets warmer, electricity load drops because the few people that heat with electricity turn off their heaters, or the gas fans that pump warm air through homes get turned off. But at high temperatures, if it gets warmer, you see a very steep increase in electricity load because those of us who actually do have air conditioners start turning them on, and the only way to operate those currently is using electricity. That temperature response varies greatly across space in California. So the blue dashed line tells you what roughly is a 25% increase over base load in a 60 to 65 degree day. So if we look at a couple of example ones right here, for example, in Imperial Valley, which is a very, very hot area of California, you see really significant increases during hot days versus at LAWP. It's not so big. Bottom right here you have PG&E, which again shows significant increases. So this is very much a macro level picture that doesn't tell us anything about the residential sector per se, since it looks across all sectors and all the electricity pulsating through these grids at any point in time. So I started stepping back and trying to understand better what happens at the individual sector level. And in economics, there's been a trend towards using micro household level data instead of stepping back and using these very aggregate level data like I do here, and really letting the data speak instead of deciding up front what the functional forms are or imposing a whole lot of structure on the problem, really letting the data do the work here. So this is what I'm going to show you next. For those of you who are not from California, it's impossible that all 11,000 of you are from California. It's a big state. It's a beautiful state. Electricity consumption in the residential sector here, those are the ones that of us that live here, has increased fourfold since 1960. Its share in total electricity consumption has gone from roughly a quarter to a third. So the total consumption here is roughly the same as that of Finland, Argentina, or half the consumption of Mexico. We consume a whole lot of electricity. Even though we don't use coal to produce electricity in California, we certainly do buy electricity that is produced with coal from neighboring states. What we have here, and these are the data we have, is most of the electricity, 82% of households get their electrons from PG&E, San Diego Gas and Electric, and Southern California Edison. And we have all of their data, plus there's over 100 municipal utilities which service households in different areas. But most of it comes from these three big ones. So what are we doing in this paper, or in this set of papers? I'm going to assume that weather is essentially random in the short run here. So you know the climate where you live, but the fluctuations around some sort of mean where you live are random shocks which you will respond to on a day-to-day basis. So whether you actually turn on your air conditioner or not on a given day depends on these random fluctuations around some sort of mean, and I'm going to use that variation in electricity consumption at the household level and correlate that to random variation in weather to extract a response function of how electricity consumption at the household level responds to hotter days. I'm going to let this be very flexible, nicely nonlinear functional form without just using a polynomial or something like that. I'm also going to let that response vary across the state, since if you live in El Centro, you most certainly do have an air conditioner. For the lucky few of you who live in San Francisco, I doubt you do have an air conditioner. So how you respond to hotter days certainly depends on where you live in California. I'm then going to link this up to climate models. I'm also going to link this to some simplistic scenarios of what happens to electricity price in California under, say, a cap and trade system. And I'm also going to bound the effect here by showing what would happen under different scenarios of population growth. Just to be clear here, I'm not trying to sell forecasts. What I'm trying to understand here is how responsive is electricity consumption to changes in these different factors, and give us a rough order of magnitude idea of how important climate is relative to prices, relative to population. Forecasts of this to the end of the century are clearly as much a storytelling exercise as they are just scenarios, if you want to call it that. So here's where people get jealous. Through an agreement with these investor-owned utilities, we have every single electricity bill for every household serviced by these utilities. So this is now close to a billion bills over a 10-year period. I only use 2003 to 2006 here, simply because I can sample very nicely and I have enough weather variation here, but I could certainly expand this. I'm going to separate out households who receive subsidies on their electricity bills. If you're very poor in California, you get a different price than I do, for example. I'm going to limit it to households which have regular billing periods, and I'm also going to drop bills that consume less than 2 kilowatt hours, which are vacation homes where you even turn off your refrigerator, or homes who consume more than 80 kilowatt hours, which are, I think, essentially home-based agricultural production facilities, because that's just a whole lot of electricity. I can't use all these observations because I don't have a cluster, so I use a sampling strategy to get a representative sample to do my statistical analysis on, but this all works out and it's nicely representative of the overall population. So skipping the usual 5 slides on how I do the statistics here, which I would be happy to send you in paper form, what I want to show you is, without assuming that people turn on their air conditioners in El Centro and assuming that people in San Francisco don't, all I'm doing here is regressing electricity consumption at the household level on measures of temperature and showing how that responsiveness varies across temperature bins and space. So what you have in the top left here is Arcata. That's the northwesternmost part of the state. It's very coastal, so you get a very flat response of electricity consumption and temperature. If you look at the, if you treat this like a matrix, 4th row, 3rd column, that's El Centro. That's the hot part right here. You get a very steep response of electricity consumption in weather. Overall, the point I'm trying to make with this slide here is there's a tremendous amount of variability in response across space right here. The takeaway message from this slide should, of course, be that if you just do a California level analysis and there's differential amount of warming across state predicted here, by just looking at the aggregate, you're going to get the wrong answer because of these nonlinearities here. If we map this out, the colors here are zip codes for which I have actual electricity bills. Yellow here means mild increases. Red means increases in per household consumption greater than 60%. So what we're seeing here, let's just go right to the extreme under the A2 scenario, which may be a conservative projection of what happens to emissions by the end of the century. The Central Valley and southeastern parts of the state are going to experience significant increases in electricity consumption simply due to warming. There's no population growth, there's no income growth or anything like that in these projections yet. If we translate this into what happens to aggregate consumption from the residential sector, we're going to see that by the end of the century, and if you look at the bottom row in this table, we're going to see increases for the A2 scenario somewhere between 48 and 55%. If we somehow manage to get to the B1 scenario, if you're following the news today, which seems unlikely, but if we get there, those increases are about 20%. These numbers are much, much larger than what's currently in the literature. So, and they're consistent with national level estimates by a different paper by Greenstone and Deschênes, so I'm pretty confident in these numbers. Now that's just climate, right? That's just weather. What happens if we worry about changes in price? So if we get a cap and trade, electricity becomes more expensive. I can come up with price elasticities, which here vary by income group, and see what happens to electricity consumption if we ramp up price. This here is the baseline scenario, just climate change. If I increase price once by 30% by 2020, I'm going to get lower increases in electricity consumption, 33% by end of the century. If I tighten the cap or I increase price again due to whatever factors, again by 2040 here, I get increases of about 18% for the A2 scenario by end of century. So a 60% increase in electricity prices here roughly offsets half of the anticipated consumption. But again, this is conditional on buying the behavioral assumptions here about how people respond to price, which we could argue about over coffee outside later. Population. So back to our just climate scenario here. This is the 48% scenario. There are official projections at the county level of what happens to population in California. They're low, medium, and high. The low and medium ones are somewhere in between those two is what we've seen so far. The high scenario I'm about to show you is going to put 130 million people in the state of California by end of century. I call that an unrealistic scenario, at least at this point. But if we just add population growth, the low scenario, to the climate warming, we're at 113% increase by end of century. If we take the medium population growth scenario, we're about by an increase of about 258% by end of century, and this is the 130 million population scenario, which is clearly somewhat unrealistic. The point I'm trying to make here is not by these numbers, but the point I'm trying to make here from a regulatory point of view, how many households we will have in the state and where they locate is going to clearly affect how many electrons households are going to purchase to charge their cellular phones and use their iPads, and most importantly, how much they cool. Now, I have 3 minutes left. What I wanted to show you here is some very recent work that's not out yet. I know this is not what AGU folks usually do. You would never show slides of stuff that's never published, hasn't been published yet, I think. So here is a map. What I tried to do here is estimate the response function at the zip code level and show you here the highest temperature, the temperature response at the highest temperature bin I can actually estimate that temperature response for. So red zip codes here are very temperature responsive, white ones are not so temperature responsive. What I'm going to be interested in is that responsiveness, meaning how quick you are to turn on your air conditioner, how much of that can I explain by income, prices, and socio-demographics? So unfortunately, I don't have prices yet, but what I have is income, climate, elevation, how many people live in your zip code, and the characteristics of your population, meaning how many Caucasians, Latinos, African Americans, and so on. The two coefficients that come out significant here over and over again are heat, meaning how warm it is in the summer. This is sort of climate, and income. So wealthier households living in hotter areas of California are more likely to have a steep electricity response, which is very much consistent with the economic literature of how people choose to adopt appliances to adapt to changing conditions, and in this case here, air conditioners. Why does this matter? What I showed you before simply said, assume the current distribution of air conditioners and let it get hotter. This is what we call an intensive margin adjustment. What this here tells you is, what if I let climate change, meaning the mean temperature in your area, get warmer? This will let you get at the question of how does the response of electricity consumption change by you buying air conditioners. I can't formally model the purchase decision, but I can show how the slope of this response function changes as it gets warmer. That's what we call an extensive margin adjustment. To conclude, what I would like to show you here is, this is just a back of the envelope calculation. The light gray line is the overall California temperature response without taking into account this extensive margin adjustment. The dark line is taken into account a conservative estimate of what climate will be by end of century and what the overall California response function will look like. That's a 20% increase at the high temperature bin, which means we're going to have significant upward pressures on electricity consumption, both from intensive and extensive margin adjustments. The one thing that's clearly not in here is the fact that policymakers are pushing on the other dimension by making air conditioners more efficient and homes better insulated. So I'll conclude here in my last 20 seconds that weather is important here. It's important to take space into account specifically because these are highly nonlinear relationships and warming isn't homogeneous across the state. Adaptation is going to lead to a steeper temperature response during hot days, and hopefully efficiency gains in air conditioners will offset some of this effect. But I think the most important part from a policy point of view here is we have a goal, 80% reduction in CO2 emissions or greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 relative to 2000, if I get my numbers right. There's a tremendous amount of pressure already on here from increased incomes, population, and climate change that will make meeting that goal potentially a more challenging one than we anticipated. So I'm done. Thank you very much.
Does anyone have a question before Max runs away? I'm not going to run a very strict time here. So, yeah, please.
So have I looked at some recent research that shows that there is local cooling in some parts of the state? I'm using the downscaled climate scenarios that have some of that in it, right? So we see that because I think the fog rolls in. Again, I'm an economist, I'm going to plead ignorance here, but there could be some local cooling in coastal areas. And these models I'm using have that in there to a certain degree. I haven't explicitly explored that source of variation of what happens here, but these models show some of that. That's it? Okay. Thank you.
Okay, very cool stuff. Our next speaker is Jeff Shaman. He'll be talking about ENSO pandemic influenza connection.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. This is work that I've done in conjunction with Mark Lipsitch, who's at the Harvard School of Public Health. And we're looking at an association between the occurrence of human pandemics of influenza and ENSO. And as this is a union session, I thought I would start with some very basic stuff on both the climate and the flu side. So the El Niño Southern Oscillation, or ENSO, is a coupled ocean-atmosphere phenomenon that it spans the breadth of the equatorial Pacific from Indonesia to the Americas. It's coupled in the sense that the atmosphere affects the ocean and the ocean affects the atmosphere. It has two extreme phases. One is El Niño, the other is La Niña. The El Niño phase, or the warm phase, occurs when that tilt flattens out there and you get a warming of central and eastern equatorial Pacific sea surface temperatures, a raise of height in that area too, and a deepening of the thermocline. And associated with this on the atmospheric side is a reorganization of some of the convection over that warm water. So you get convection in the central and equatorial eastern Pacific, anomalous convection, and that results in changes in the circulation. The opposite phase, the La Niña phase, is sort of an intensification of the schematic that you see right there. You have a greater warming in the western Pacific warm pool and over Indonesia, a shallowing of the thermocline in the eastern equatorial Pacific, and precipitation anomalously organizes more so in that region of warming in the western Pacific and a strengthening of the Walker circulation. Now, ENSO for a long time has been known to be associated with various regional impacts on meteorological conditions, including temperatures and precipitation around the world. However, the response is highly variable. It's variable in both space and time. So, for instance, this is shows you what El Niño teleconnections for the warm phase look like. And you can see that if you just look at Africa, the response in boreal winter on the top is similar from the response in boreal summer on the bottom. Similarly, if you go in space, the response in Africa is not identical, obviously, to the response that you see in North America. And the same can be said also for La Niña teleconnections. Again, you have a lot of spatial variability and you have changes in the response through time. So as ENSO affects meteorology, there's a lot of ENSO-related regional meteorological variability that affects other sectors, impacts other sectors that are themselves affected by weather. And these include things such as agricultural, economic productivity, fisheries, ecosystem health, and human health, of course. And because ENSO is predictable at a variety of timescales, 3-6 months in advance, if you can identify robust relationships between ENSO and those sectors, you may have the ability to actually predict those outcomes. So it offers the lure, the enticing lure, that there may be some sort of predictability that can be gleaned from making these studies. So just to give you a few examples, one of the early ones done by Mark Kane and his group was to look at the impact of ENSO on maize yields in Zimbabwe. And what that plot on the left shows you is a time series of corn yields in Zimbabwe, and superimposed with it is an index of ENSO variability, a measure of sea surface temperatures in the eastern equatorial Pacific. And you can see they're highly correlated. You can also see on the upper right plot, pointing to Zimbabwe right there, that is an area with a teleconnection with ENSO. So the idea being is if you have some sort of lead prediction of what's going to happen to your corn yield, all else being equivalent, you can manage it, you can adapt to it, you can change your irrigation practices, you can rotate your crops, you can address the coming season in a different way, having been informed by what we know about ENSO and this teleconnection. Another impact, and this one goes to an ecosystem, is ENSO has been shown to affect the health and behavior of migratory birds. And it does this by altering bird biomass, the flight and stopover patterns of migratory birds, the time to molt, and the population density. And the last one that I'm going to talk about is on flu. There have been a number of studies and regional studies that have explored the effects of ENSO on seasonal epidemic influenza for places such as France, the US, Japan. And these have been regional studies in which what they do is they take a time series that's an indicator of influenza activity or influenza incidence. It could be excess pneumonia and influenza mortality data. It could be influenza-like illness, which is the number of cases of presenting influenza-like illness reporting at certain sentinel clinics and hospitals in a region. And then they look then at the interannual variability of that and how that might be associated with ENSO or with local weather. Now, for this talk, I'm going to actually be focusing not on the seasonal flu, but on the pandemic flu. So I'm going to have to give you a little primer right here on the difference between the two and a little bit about how the immune system works. So typically when your body is infected by a pathogen, say a virus, it mounts an immune response and it generates an antibody that binds to that pathogen, or an antigen as it's called. And by binding, your body is then able to clear the virus out of your system. Now, your immune system has a memory component to it. It's like it keeps a filing cabinet on all this stuff. So if you're infected with a chickenpox once, if you're ever actually infected subsequently with chickenpox, the first thing your immune system does, it goes into the filing cabinet, rummages through it, and it tries to find an antibody that will bind to this new pathogen. If it finds something that works, it can quickly and preemptively clear the virus from your system so that you don't get sick, you don't develop a high infection rate, you don't shed the virus, you don't dump it into the environment, and you don't make somebody else sick as a result. If it's a new virus, though, it's a longer process. If it can't find anything in that filing cabinet, in that memory system, that is an antibody that works, it has to go through a longer process of generating a new antibody. Once it finds that, it can then clear the infection. But you will, in the meantime, get sick and probably shed a lot of the virus into the environment and make other people sick. Now, influenza is complicated because there are multiple strains of influenza that abound. There are three dominant types or subtypes that affect humans and are responsible for seasonal influenza. They're A, H1N1, A, H3N2, and B. And they don't confer cross-immunity on one another. So if you're infected with H3N2 this flu season, that's not going to make you immune to H1N1 next year. That antibody that you develop to it in the filing cabinet is not going to be effective and it's not going to bind to it. In addition, there's a complication in the sense that these viruses are constantly changing. They're constantly evolving, and they're constantly be subject to natural selection by our host, by the immune defense of our body systems. So basically what happens is a process that's known as antigenic drift. And these are small, gradual changes in the structure and the surface glycoproteins of the virus that result from point mutations of the virus. And as these glycoproteins change, as the antigen drifts, it may no longer be recognized by the antibodies that were formerly effective against it. So for instance, if you get H3N2 this year, in 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, that virus will have mutated sufficiently far enough away from that point that that antibody that you hold in that filing cabinet in your immune system is no longer capable of binding to the H3N2 virus, and you'll get sick again. Okay? So you got three strains, and you have them constantly changing, and that's why you can recurrently get infected with seasonal influenza. Now, this has to be contrasted with pandemic flu. Pandemic flu arises from a different process. It's a process called antigenic shift that results from something known as reassortment. And that happens when a single host is simultaneously infected by more than one flu strain. So the way a virus works is it's just a fragment of RNA surrounded by some proteins, and when it comes into your body, it hijacks your cellular machinery and makes lots of copies of itself, which you then shed into the environment, and it affects other people. And typically, if it's just one virus, it makes perfect or near perfect copies of itself. However, particularly in the case of influenza, if two different strains are infecting the same cell, instead of making perfect copies of it, it will make hybrids. And these new little beasts, which will come out, can be something to which the whole population of the world virtually has no immunity to, no prior immunity. And that's what seeds a pandemic. And influenza is very good at this because it happens to be a segmented virus, so it will just take 3 segments from one of the flu viruses, 5 from another, strap them together, and you got a new hybridized monster out there that's going. So again, the key difference here is the difference between antigenic drift and antigenic shift. And we're going to be focusing on antigenic shift, that event, that reassortment event that is critical for the onset and the development of a novel pandemic strain that can then quickly spread around the world in a population that's wholly susceptible to it. So what we want to do is we want to look at the timing of this reassortment event. We don't want to look at the spread of the virus because we already saw that ENSO was highly variable in its impact. We want to pivot off that key point where you actually have that reassortment and look at conditions in the equatorial Pacific and see if in any way they're associated with the timing of the onset of pandemic flu. We only have 4 well-documented human pandemics of flu in 1918, 1957, 1968, and 2009. These are sufficiently well documented that we know basically when it first emerged, and that we're presuming also that the reassortment took place in the months preceding that first emergence, which is actually quite a reasonable assumption because these things transmit fairly efficiently. So if we look at this, and we can see in the table at the left, they're dated at March 1918, February 1957, July 1968, and March 2009. If we look at conditions in the Pacific prior to each of those last 4 pandemics, you can see that in all 4 instances they were in the La Nina phase. This happens irrespective of what indicator you use of ENSO, whether it's Nino 3.0, the different sea surface temperature region, Nino 3.4, the Southern Oscillation Index, whatever. It's there and it's robust. You can see it there in distributed fashion. You can see how it was very intense and broad for the 1918, at least in the reconstructions of it. You can also see it in 57, 68, and mildly so in 2009. If we do some statistical analysis of this, we see that on average the SST anomaly for the Nino 3 region was about 3/4 of a degree Celsius. We can bootstrap resample the record for that November through January period for SST anomalies then from 4 arbitrary years, and we can see that the chance of getting this, the likelihood of getting this by chance alone is less than 7%. So it's marginally statistically significant. In addition, the finding is insensitive to the precise months we use for the SST index, whether we used November through January, October through December, which SST index we use, Nino 3.0, Nino 3.4, and whether we include a less well-documented Russian pandemic that occurred in the late 1880s. So, why might this association be real? Well, that begs the question in the title of the talk, is it coincident or is it causal? We have all of 4 data points to hang our hat on right here. However, it does seem to us that there may be a sensible and testable hypothesis behind all this, and that comes back to the bird example. So ENSO has been shown, as I said before, to affect the health, the behavior, time to molting, the flight, stopover patterns of migratory birds. And migratory birds are key for influenza transmission. Avian hosts can host both human, bird, and swine flus, and probably some others, and they're the key reservoir for human influenza in the animal kingdom. So what we think may be going on is that La Nina conditions are bringing together divergent influenza subtypes that have been kept apart in the years between La Nina events, bringing them together into one portion of the world from separate portions of the world, and favoring that reassortment of influenza through the simultaneous multiple infection of a single individual host or hosts. And that generates those novel pandemic strains. Basically, we're saying that the likelihood of a pandemic increases during a La Nina phase. So in order for this to work, there has to be a role for the birds in all of the 4 last pandemics. 1957 and 1968 pandemics are thought to have originated from a reassortment of avian influenza viruses, so that checks with it. 1918 is really unknown. 2009 is thought to have arisen from the reassortment of 2 swine influenza viruses, however. In order for this hypothesis to work, it will require that an avian species was actually involved in the transport, the infection and transport of 1 or more of these viruses to facilitate that final reassortment in pigs. So as I said, bird hosts can be readily infected by swine flu. They often are, and it would require a bird to actually transport this to a region where this virus was novel, perhaps non-existent, hang out in a pigsty or a pig farm, which the birds do, on a migratory route that it might not have encountered otherwise, and result in that reassortment. So basically, what we're thinking here is that the birds are kept apart for most of the other time, but when the conditions change significantly or substantially in a La Nina event on a global scale, you get an intermingling of bird species that theretofore had not been coming together. And that intermittent intermingling allows the viruses previously to have drifted due to antigenic drift, drifted apart, and then you bring them back together and you can reassort them and make something quite novel and very infectious, potentially for humans. Now the thing about it is this is theoretically a testable hypothesis. And the way to study it is to look at influenza virus population gene flow. Okay? So they're starting to do this where they genotype influenza viruses in cats and in pigs and dogs and birds and humans, and they're developing a data bank of it. And as we look at this, we can identify not just reassortment events that result in human pandemics, which are incredibly rare, but we can look at reassortment events that result in pandemics in these other species as well, or may just be reassortments and result in something that's kind of junk. And we can look at that prospectively through time and see how the frequency of those events varies with the phase of ENSO, something that we can do. In addition, we can also look further at how ENSO is impacting migratory bird health, their migration and their mixing with domestic fauna, and we can look at, we use all this information to try to substantiate whether or not this is actually just coincidental or causal. The table there lists some of those possible studies that could be undertaken. So in conclusion, basically we found that the onset of each of the last 4 well-dated human influenza pandemics was preceded by a La Nina phase condition in the equatorial Pacific. And then we hypothesized that ENSO variability affects the fitness, flight activity, and intermingling of migratory bird species and alters the likelihood of host co-infection by multiple influenza strains and consequent virus reassortment, the generation of that novel pandemic strain. Human influenza pandemics are fortunately rare, unfortunately for this study, but fortunately for the human race. But this hypothesis could be tested through further study of ENSO-associated changes in influenza population genetics, virus prevalence in those various hosts, and avian migration patterns. Thanks.
Time for a question? You're all scared. Silent.
We're all going to die eventually, so don't worry about it. David.
Yeah, you have to be looking for a pandemic, but if you just took influenza incidents and just correlated to them, would you expect to see anything? Because you still have, every incident with some new birds around.
The question is whether or not, do we have to look at pandemics? Can we look at just seasonal flu and whether it's associated with ENSO because it's still affecting the birds? I think that's a lot harder because what you'd be looking for, the process that generates point mutations is just sort of a random selective procedure of the virus trying to evade host immunity and being selected by that. Whereas the reassortment is more of a random process that has to do with this co-infection. So it's, the mechanism there is really something that, to my mind, would be akin to making a pandemic possible, but not really affecting the likelihood of seasonal flu, which is actually pervasive. It's there every year. It's constantly floating around. I think there may be indicators of some of those studies where seasonal flu is modulated on the regional and local scale by ENSO-related meteorological conditions. But there's no onset with seasonal flu. It's a gradual process. Yeah. Question is there much data documenting where these pandemics started? Yes, there is. 2 of them have started in the Americas, and 2 of them are thought to have started in Southeast Asia. So the question again is, would there be one dominant place where this reassortment would take place? Because typically La Nina is preferentially affecting bird stopover patterns. Maybe, in La Nina you got a huge wetting of Indonesia, Southeast Asia, maybe that's the area where it happens. But 2 of them are there and 2 of them are in other places. So in some thinking maybe that undermines the hypothesis a bit, but really it needs to be investigated, this idea of taking birds apart, segregating them in most phases, and bringing them together in this one phase of ENSO. So, thanks.
Okay, thanks. What Jeff forgot to mention is we have a big La Nina coming up. So be careful. Okay, our next speaker is David Battisti from University of Washington. He'll be talking about the impact of global warming on global crop yields due to changes in pest pressure.
Is there a pointer like that? Okay. Oh, wait, here we go. Yeah, okay, good. Okay, there's the outline. Just one slide that shows changes in climate, because I think most people are familiar with that. I'll spend most of the talk talking about how we developed the Pest Model, and I'll just show you results from one climate model, because they all tell you pretty much the same thing. So it'll just give you an idea of what we expect. Okay, changes in climate. We're just going to adopt the projected changes in climate from the emission scenarios and the climate models that are used for the AR4, and we'll do the same thing for the AR5. Okay, we haven't done that yet. So here's a typical temperature change. And in fact, all we're dealing with in this pest model is temperature changes at this point, and I'll tell you why in a second. So that's the summer average, summer northern hemisphere average temperature change at the end of this century compared to the end of last century with a kind of a middle-of-the-road emission scenario. The main thing to point out is that the mid-latitudes have the largest, mid-altitude land places have the largest temperature change, about 3.5 degrees or so. Right, okay. And just due to that temperature change alone, I'm not going to talk about it today, but just that increased heat stress on crops should reduce yields in the tropics and subtropics by about 30 to 40%, actually under idealized conditions with enough water and nutrients. Okay, so there's that we're dealing with to start with. But the second thing to deal with is the pest. And so we're going to talk a little bit about a pest consumption model that uses well-established relationship between temperature and metabolism in species, and in particular ectotherms, insects in this case, and establish a population growth model that includes the constraints that evolution has on the populations as a function of temperature, and we approximate the growth rate as a logistics equation. And then we'll just tune the pest model, given the existing climate and existing pest damage today. So there's a well-established relationship between metabolic rate and temperature. It's basically an exponential function of inverse of temperature. So as temperature goes up, metabolic rate goes up until you get to very high temperatures, like 40 degrees Celsius. And that's, you can see that here for different things here. If I remember right on this plot here, there's plants, different animals. I can't remember if lizards is on there, but all I can see here, fish, amphibians. But basically, as temperature goes up, which is going this way along the x-axis towards me, metabolic rate goes up. And okay, and of course, if metabolic rate goes up, to survive, you just have to eat more to fuel the system if you're using more energy, right? So consumption scales with metabolic rate, and metabolic rate scales in a well-known way with temperature. And that has to do with just the catalytic enzyme reaction. So it's kind of nice. Okay, so what I can show you a plot here that calculate the current metabolic rates using current climates, and then which includes the annual cycle of temperature, diurnal variations of temperature. We're using 20 years of data, and we're doing this for the annual cropping season. The cropping season, and then we're going to integrate this thing over the year. So it's the basically the annual average metabolic rate for an insect, and I'm going to show you the result here in a second. Then we're going to do the same thing using climate for 75 years into the future toward the end of the century. Right. And then look at the proportional change. So it's the change divided by the metabolic rate or the consumption today. Okay, so this is a picture, and you could fill in the world map if you wanted to here, but what's shown is where we grow, maize today. So where there's color here is where we've done the calculation for maize. And basically, purple means about a double. So 1 here means you've doubled. Okay, so that basically for a bug to stay alive in the future here, it's going to have to eat twice as much in the mid-latitudes along this region here. And in the tropics, you also have to eat more, but it's not quite as much. Okay, relative metabolic rate. Okay. So the other part of this, the population model, takes advantage of evolution's done a really nice thing for us. That basically in the tropics, you're at a very high temperature, very narrow range of temperature, small seasonal cycle, and animals and insects in particular have evolved to do well in a narrow temperature range. And if you're not in that temperature range, you haven't done well. So there's a very if you measure some fitness, the ability to, say, reproduce, thrive and reproduce as a function of temperature here, there's a very narrow range in the tropics where insects do really well. Once you get beyond an optimal temperature, you don't do well at all. So at high enough temperatures, you crash, basically. In the mid-latitudes, of course, this distribution is, the sensitivity to temperature is much broader because if you live in the mid-latitudes, you have to deal with very large seasonal cyclone temperatures, very large diurnal cyclone temperatures. So organisms have evolved to withstand a much higher temperature range. And so if you think about this here now, if you're out here in the tropics and you're already at or near your threshold, an increase in temperature puts you beyond the optimal, so your fitness goes down, so the ability to get from one generation to the next reduces. In the mid-latitude, that's not true. Increasing temperature in the mid-latitudes, even a lot, actually puts you in a better shape to grow. So if you use that and then you have a population model, so take that fitness or that growth rate for population, you plug it into a logistics model, you can come up with a statement of population density. Okay, and let's see, the growth rate here is taken from controlled experiments and adjusted for in-field effects for ectotherms, and the model is assumed a closing and equilibrium pest population. Okay, so that a small fraction of the insects at the end of one crop season survive to the beginning of the next one to start eating again. Okay, so if you look at the change in population, you get something that looks different than metabolism. That if you live in the mid-latitudes here, it's all blue. That's where population increases on the order of 20%. But if you live in the tropics here, the population of insects decreases by about 20%. And that's simply because you're already at or above the optimal threshold for temperature. So the insect population decreases. So you end up with a situation where in the tropics in general, populations will decrease, but metabolism go up. In the mid-latitudes, population goes up and metabolism goes up. So you can see what's going to happen here. The last step of the pest model is to basically take the insect population density, multiply it by the metabolism rate, how much they're eating, and integrate this over the course of a growing season. And then you basically tune this model so that the total amount consumed by the pest is equal to the total crop loss measured today. And I've got down here the figures here for the global average loss of crops due to pest. In rice, 15% of the global production is lost today due to pest. In maize, it's about 10%. In wheat, it's about 8%. How am I doing on time? Oh, good. Great. Okay. So caveats. This is a very basic model. It's a model to say, okay, let's start the discussion for what pests are going to do in a climate change world. It takes kind of an average insect how do I want to say this? We're not looking at a specific pest on a specific crop. We're just looking at the overall effects that we know that all pests, the metabolism should increase as you warm. And in the mid-latitudes, pest populations should increase, and in the tropics, they should decrease. Let's see, changes in the condition of the crop. Is it thriving in the new climate? Are not taken into account. We assume no evolution, that the pests don't evolve over this period, which is not a great assumption. We ignore changes in precipitation on this, and we assume that the pesticide use is the same as today. Cropping, timing, and patterns don't change as a first cut. So it's basically just a model to start looking at how big will these changes be, and where will they be significant, and where should you not have to worry about them. Okay, so let me show you some results, and actually these results are relatively insensitive to the climate model or the mission scenario you use in terms of the order of magnitude of the response and the pattern of the response. So we'll look at the change in the yields and production of the three major crops, maize, wheat, and rice. Okay, but actually these results apply to other crops as well. We just haven't done those yet. Okay, like soy, for example. Okay, so we're going to use the projected climate change, the annual cycle of temperature, that's projected by climate models. We're just going to use one for today just to show you the basic results, and that's from the Hadley Center model. We're going to, on top of the observed annual cycle that we're using today. We're using the observed natural variability, which includes daily, monthly variability in temperatures. And then we're going to use that same variations today, and we're just going to add it on to the mean climate change projected in the future. And the reason why we're doing that is because we know that the GCMs overpredict the increase in the temperature variance, and we're trying to get away from that effect. So this is the most conservative estimate. We're going to assume that the same fraction of pests survive diapause, that is the period where they don't grow so well because food supply, the crop is basically over. What fraction of that survives to the next cropping season? We're going to assume that doesn't change, and that's probably not a good assumption. The fractional survive will probably increase. So this is, again, a conservative estimate I'm going to show you. I'm going to assume that crops grow in the same region as today. Okay. So this is the result for rice, and the top panel is the loss, the fraction of the yield today that's lost due to insects. The bottom panel is what happens at the end of the century. And I'll just point out here that this is rice. So the important countries are China over here, which is in light blue, India and Bangladesh. Those are the 3 out of the top 4 rice producers in the world are those countries. And today you have losses that are on the order of 10 to 20% of the crops in these areas due to pest. And if you look at the projected climate changes, you see that China goes from light blue to dark blue. That's an increase of 10%, so going from 10 to 20%. India and Bangladesh go from 20 to 30%. So you have about a 10% increase in the loss of yield due to pests. Okay? So that's 10% in addition to what we have today. And again, if you assume that in a warmer climate, in higher latitudes, you know, the winter is not quite as severe, you have more pests around, and probably it's true that the number of pests are going to make it from one season around to the next season is going to go up. So this is probably a conservative estimate. Okay, here's maize. Top panel is today. Okay, and make sure I can see this here. So in the two top maize producing countries today in the world are U.S. here and China, and the loss today is roughly 6% or so in these countries. 6% of the yield today is lost due to insects. And if you look into the future, you're looking at a doubling, basically, another 6%. So double the loss that we have today. Anything else here? In general, losses are greatest in mid-latitudes. So if you just look at the losses today, they tend to be greater in the tropics than in the mid-latitudes. But if you look at the changes are actually larger in the mid-latitudes than they are in the tropics. And that's simply because in the mid-latitudes you have a combined effect of increasing metabolism and increasing numbers of pests, whereas in the tropics you have increasing metabolism but decreasing number of pests because you're already beyond the optimal temperature. Okay, the last one to look at here is wheat. The 2 top wheat producing countries are the U.S. here, which is in light green, and Russia. And this blue strip here is where a lot of the wheat is grown in Russia. I guess it's, well, I'm loosely using the word Russia here, but it includes near the Caspian Sea all the way across. The yield loss here also doubles. In the U.S., it doubles to about 15%. In Russia, it doubles to about 20%. So again, factor of 2 increase in of yield or crop due to increasing pests. If you translate this into dollar terms, in maize, in the U.S., you're looking at $4 billion a year. China's almost $2 billion a year. France, $230 million. Argentina, $220 million. These 4 countries produce 67% of the maize in the world, right? And they're going to be losing, you know, on the order of 6 to 8% of the production. Okay. In wheat here, U.S. again is the lead producer in wheat in the world. $1.4 billion lost. China, I can't read this. $1.2 billion. You're adding it up, and just for these 4 countries, which produce, you know, sort of half of the yield in the world, you're looking at 6 billion, 3 billion annual losses. Okay. For rice, of course, the number is a lot bigger. These 4 countries account for 60% of the global rice production in the world, and then 40% of the world's population. China is a $5 to $6 billion loss. I should say that if you take different emission scenarios or different assumptions in the model and you plug them through and you work them through, you can get numbers that vary plus or minus 10% here, right? Those are not the weaknesses here. The weaknesses are trying to understand. Here we're just dealing with how many more pests you're going to have and how much more do they want to consume. But of course, you have changes in predators as well, right? And you have changes in cropping systems and when they're going to plant. So there's a lot of other things that go into this. But here there's ballpark numbers to kind of anticipate. And if you sum up the rice damages for these countries, you end up with numbers of $12 billion. So maybe for the 3 major crops worldwide, you're talking $30, $40, $50 billion a year. I don't know, is that a big number? It is to me, but. Okay, conclusions. Is this okay? Sure. So we got this mechanistic model, which is based on empirical things, and in some cases metabolism in terms of basic biochemistry. It shows that yield losses due to increased pest pressure and climate will be greatest in the mid-latitudes because of the increased metabolism and increased population growth. And we're using it as a tool to explore where the most serious problems will be. The preliminary results suggest that climate change will have a pretty large impact on pests, basically doubling the pest loss in the next 75 years. And the losses are greatest where production's the greatest in the U.S., China, India. And you expect comparable losses in other crops. We just haven't done it. Okay, and this will be on top of losses due to temperature changes, due to lack of water, things like that, which we haven't dealt with. Okay, that's it.
Any questions for David?
I think probably one of the things you want to look at most in improving the model is there much evidence of crop changes occurring over history because of pest pressure? I can think of things like wine, where the wine industry in Europe is basically saved by the Americans. I don't know if there's similar issues for pests themselves. Is there evidence to show that farmers actually do change their crops in response and are able to mitigate some of these effects?
Yeah, so is there evidence that in the past, due to changes in pest pressures that farmers have that it's affected their crops and what they do? I'm pretty sure the answer to that is yes. I don't have the information right off. I mean, I know that on our farm when we had pests, we did things differently the next year. But I think the one thing that's kind of interesting here, if you go, this is for me an interesting thing. If you go back to the Eocene and the what's called the PETM, this time where in the Eocene where temperatures spiked, you can actually look at the damage on leaves. People have done this, and you can look at, so it's called the herbivory, how much leaf has been eaten by insects. And when the temperature shoots up, the amount of holes in leaves actually goes up dramatically. So it just seems like, nature's telling you that bugs increase a lot when temperature goes up, and the herbivory rate, how much plant is eaten by pests, actually increases.
So those were, I thought, 3 really impressive, interesting talks. I think it gives you an indication of the stuff that was left out and is over in the poster session is also quite interesting. So I encourage you to go over there, and let's thank our speakers again for some great talks.